When Italy lost World War II, the Allies agreed to strip Italy of all its African colonies. However, just 5 years later, Italian troops once again returned to Somalia to take control of the colony. So why was that? Why was Somalia returned to Italy despite its defeat in the war? In 1947, Italy signed the Paris Peace Treaty, in which it renounced all claims to its pre-war colonies, which included Libya, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland. The treaty stipulated that the future of these territories would be decided collectively by the Soviet Union, Great Britain, United States, and France. If these powers failed to reach an agreement within a year, it would be up to the United Nations General Assembly to make a decision. The four victorious powers had all very different goals when it came to Italian colonies. Great Britain, seeking to solidify and expand its influence in East Africa, wanted the Italian colonies for itself. British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin proposed the creation of a Greater Somalia under British trusteeship. At this point, it is important to explain the concept of United Nations trusteeships. The United Nations was fundamentally opposed to colonialism, but recognized that many European colonies had historically excluded native populations from governance. As a result, these populations were often seen as lacking the administrative experience necessary to manage modern, independent states. To address this, the UN introduced the trusteeship system, which it inherited from the League of Nations, whereby territories would be placed under the temporary administration of a designated power to prepare them for self-governance and eventual independence. However, Britain viewed trusteeship as a strategic opportunity, treating it as an extension of traditional colonialism. This was particularly evident in its ambitions for Libya, a former Italian colony that Britain considered vital to maintaining control over the Mediterranean. Similarly, the Soviet Union sought trusteeship over Tripolitania, hoping to secure a Mediterranean base for its fleet. When this request was rejected, Soviet diplomats shifted their stance, opposing any form of trusteeship and instead advocating for the immediate independence of all former Italian colonies. The United States was opposed to outright colonialism, but also concerned about the potential expansion of Soviet influence in Africa. To balance these concerns, the U.S. proposed placing Italy's former colonies under the direct administration of the United Nations. And only France supported Italy retaining control of its colonies. This was not because the French had forgiven the Italians or anything, but simply because French officials feared that granting independence to these territories could inspire similar demands among France's own colonies of Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, thereby undermining their colonial empire. The four powers failed to reach an agreement within the one-year deadline, leaving the decision to the United Nations General Assembly. This shift meant that the colonial powers now had to negotiate with Asian and Latin American countries, many of which were themselves former colonies and were as such less sympathetic to European ambitions. This led to a compromise, granting immediate independence to the most developed former colony, Libya, and ceding Eritrea to Ethiopia. And as for Somaliland, the United States' approach had changed. By this time, the Cold War was in full swing, and the United States was increasingly willing to compromise its anti-colonial ideals to counter the Soviet threat. But the global community opposed the idea of Britain acquiring new territories, and immediate independence for Somaliland was deemed likely to result in chaos. And other than that, there were few viable alternatives, as most countries didn't have the navy or the colonial experience to administer a territory in Africa. As such, Italy was chosen to administer Somaliland under a UN trusteeship. Italy already had the infrastructure and experience to govern the territory, and by this point, it had joined NATO. Assigning Somaliland to Italy meant that it would not fall into the Soviet sphere and had the added benefit as a symbolic gesture, acknowledging Italy's post-war transition from fascism to a member of the Western Bloc, which would help keep Italy out of the Soviet sphere. And so, on November 21, 1949, the UN General Assembly voted to place the Trust Territory of Somaliland under Italian administration until 1960. After this period, Somaliland was to gain independence, forming the Somali Republic together with British Somaliland. Thank you for watching. And a big thank you to my supporter on Patreon, Rostislav, 1917.